Welcome to this edition of Sound Off Extra here on the official YouTube channel for the Solomonster Sounds Off weekly podcast. We talk pro wrestling each and every Sunday. I am the Solomonster, and you can access that show on the Solomonster.com, Stitcher Radio, or in iTunes. You can subscribe to us there, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Solomonster. On this edition, I wanted to take a few minutes to give my thoughts on a book that I had finished actually a couple of months ago. I just have not had a chance to actually review it, and I promised I would. So I wanted to talk about The Hardcore Truth, which is Bob Holly's book. Came out several months ago from ECW Press. Ross Williams assisted with the writing of the book. Bob Holly, of course, a nearly 15-year veteran working for World Wrestling Entertainment, came into the company in 1994, departed in early 2009 is when he left the company. And if you look back, you will not find that many full-time active performers who had that long of a run in WWE. When I think of somebody who's been in the company for 15 years or more consecutively, I think of guys like Shawn Michaels, guys like The Undertaker. That's pretty good company to keep right there. And obviously there's been other lower-level guys who I'm sure have been with the company for a number of years as well. You think of the Brooklyn Brawler and guys like that. But the well runs pretty dry when you think of mid-card stars and top stars. So obviously he must have been doing something right for them to keep him around for that long, you know, in a company where guys come and go all the time. So he had a very lengthy run of the company. And I was very intrigued to read his book as a result because he's seen it all. He's been there for so long. He was there through the New Generation years, the Attitude Era, when he finally established himself as more than just an enhancement guy in the company. I mean, he was a solid mid-card guy in that company for a number of years in the late 90s when wrestling was booming. Later on during the Invasion years, and even towards the end of his run when they moved him over to the ECW brand before ultimately he left the company. So he's done it all, he's seen it all, and I thought, this sounds like an interesting book. He's out of wrestling. I believe he does take independent bookings and such, but he has not worked for the company for a number of years, and so here's a guy who probably has nothing to lose, and sounded interesting to me. So I read the book, and I have to say I actually very much enjoyed it. I've read a number of wrestling books. You know, Mick Foley's and Chris Jericho's are some of the ones that I would point out as being among the best. I still haven't gotten through Bret Hart's. That's like an encyclopedia. One of these days I'll get through it. And there's been a whole host of other books. This is the one that I read that I came away thinking to myself, you know, when you read a wrestling book, guys can certainly embellish. They can tell tall tales or just outright lie. Anybody who's probably read Hulk Hogan's book could attest to that. I didn't get that feeling at all when I was done reading this book. It is Bob's version of events, so there are certain situations perhaps that he talks about where you think to yourself, okay, I've heard conflicting stories about this. For example, he talks about the Clique and Kevin Nash and guys like that. And I know Nash and some of those guys will have different versions of the events that Bob tells in the book. But aside from minor examples like that, there was never a time when I said, okay, this guy's full of shit. You know, this guy seems like he's shooting from the hip. He's telling things like it is, the way that he sees it, and you could take it or leave it. And he doesn't come across as a guy who's begging for a job. You know, just the opposite. He's out of wrestling. He's very content. I don't think he ever has any intention of going back. I mean, never say never. He could be on Raw one day doing a cameo. But as he talks about, you know, the company's actually reached out to him to be a trainer down in developmental, and he's turned them down. It's just not something he's interested in. And those are the people I like to hear from because, again, they got nothing to lose. So here's how I'm going to work this. As I read the book, I took down some random notes on each chapter, kind of a stream of consciousness type of thing. And I'm just going to go by my notes here, the most interesting things that I jotted down, and I'll give some insight into that. You know, early on in the book, obviously, he talks about his upbringing, he talks about his family, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, especially the relationship or lack thereof with his father. I actually found that very interesting, and I would say to people, if you pick up the book, some people, and I've felt this way before, may have the inclination maybe to skip over certain parts, get to the good stuff, get to the wrestling stuff. You know, when I first started reading the Bret Hart book, my first inclination was, let's just go to the WWF stuff, you know, from the mid-'80s, and let's gloss over all the Stampede stuff. But you're really shortchanging yourself by doing that. This book from start to finish really is very interesting, and the family stuff is a big part of that. But in chapter 2 of the book, he talks about how when he was younger, he sustained lots of concussions. He can remember the first one that he had. There's a mention in chapter 12 of the book where he talks about his first wrestling concussion. coming during a match with the Smoking Guns the night after the 1995 Royal Rumble. It's very telling, with all the things that we're hearing about in recent years about concussions and concussion research. Obviously, stuff that's happened to certain pro athletes, the Benoit stuff from many years ago. You read about this and you start wondering. You start wondering whether it's about Bob Holly and other wrestlers from that era, how things may be for them 10, 15, 20 years from now. I'm more concerned about the people from that Attitude Era period, from, the ECW period from the mid-90s on, and the abuse that those guys took and the chair shots to the head and all that kind of stuff. What are those guys going to be like 10, 15 years from now? It's a scary thought. You've got wrestlers now who competed in the 70s who were suffering from dementia and conditions like that. And you have to think they weren't taking the kind of physical abuse that these guys were willingly taking in the mid-90s. And I never looked at Bob Holly as being one of the, even though his name was Hardcore later on, he never was one of these guys that you would see in, let's say, ECW taking all the violent chair shots to the head over and over and over again. But, if I could talk to him, one of the questions I would have for him is he worried? Is he worried about the long-term effects of those concussions? Because back then, you suffered a concussion and you went right back to wrestling. That's just how it was. In Chapter 6 of the book, makes an interesting comment about being a fan of Bret Hart. While Bret Hart was part of the Hart Foundation, he felt that everything Bret did looked realistic. He thought he was a great storyteller. And I agree. I actually made a comment like that on a recent sound-off that I recorded. Bret Hart was one of my favorites when I was younger. And one of the things I loved about Bret Hart and his style of wrestling is there was no main event guy in WWF or WCW at the time or anywhere who could take as realistic looking a beating as Bret Hart. When you watch this guy in the ring, he just looked like he was getting the shit kicked out of him all the time. He was very believable, threw a believable punch. So I'm actually with Bob Holly on that. I think Bret was one of the best at that. Chapter 8 in the book, he makes it very clear he is not a fan of Jerry Jarrett. Jerry Jarrett, I think other people have told stories like this. I think Steve Austin had the same problems with Jerry Jarrett and his son Jeff as far as them not paying talent very well. Quite frankly, they paid shit to the talent, so he talks about that. I'd be more curious to find out from Holly what he thinks of Jarrett as an actual promoter. Again, he does talk about how their treatment of talent and the pay and all that, but Jerry Jarrett had a lot of success. He's one of the more successful wrestling promoters of his time, and in fact, when the steroid scandal had engulfed the WWF in the mid-90s and Vince McMahon thought there was a very real possibility he may be sent up the river for 20 years, the person he brought in to essentially run the company for him in his absence was Jerry Jarrett. Now, thankfully, it never came to that, but I'd be curious to get Bob's thoughts on whether or not he actually respects Jerry Jarrett as a promoter, even if he didn't necessarily treat people the right way. Jim Cornette was the person who noticed Bob during his NWA days. Bob was doing a lot of jobs in the NWA, and Cornette gave him his first big break in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, so he makes it very clear that he loves Jim Cornette. Jim Cornette was very good to him. He made his television debut in the WWF at the 1994 Royal Rumble. I remember them airing those Thurman Sparky Plug vignettes on TV. I didn't realize, though, that his actual on-screen debut in the ring apparently came in that Rumble match in 94. And he talks a lot about hating the Sparky Plug name. He eventually was able to get it changed from Thurman to Bob Sparkplug Holly, and that was okay because it at least gave you an identity so that you would stand out. So the whole Sparkplug thing, it seems like he didn't really mind so much. I don't know where the hell they got the name Thurman from. That is pretty stupid. But he does talk about how it makes you stand out. He also makes the point of the parade of terrible gimmicks in 94-95 WWF. I don't know what acid trip Vince McMahon must have been on. That must have been an epic acid trip because if you remember, in the time span of a few months, we had characters like T.L. Hopper, we had Duke the Dumpster Droese, we had The Goon, we had Freddie Joe Floyd. At least Freddie Joe Floyd, he was, this happy-go-lucky, redneck, underdog-type character, which is fine. But we had a wrestling plumber, and we had a wrestling dentist, and we had, I don't understand what was going through his mind at the time. Yeah, I mean, you stand out. We still remember these crappy gimmicks, and I think that Dentist went on to have some success. I can't really remember. Mantar, half man, half tar. Half tarred is more like it. I just remember that humongous head that he put on. So a lot of these guys were a laughingstock, and a lot of them ended up not going anywhere because of their crappy gimmicks, and I think Holly actually got off easy because he had a relatively, human gimmick. I don't think he was half man, half beast. So he actually made out pretty well. He tells a really interesting story in chapter 11 of the book from WrestleMania 10 at Madison Square Garden in '94. Of course, the famous ladder match between Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon. Those guys had one of the best matches in WrestleMania history. And if you go back and watch that match now, I know it may seem kind of tame, because now in ladder matches and TLC matches and everything else, we've seen almost everything there is to see. It's a relatively normal ladder match, but it's still awesome. And so they go out there and they have this classic, and the problem is, according to the story that Bob tells in the book, is that those guys went way past their allotted time. And when those guys came backstage, Randy Savage was there. I think he may have already wrestled. I think his match may have already taken place, or it was coming up. He had a match with Crush. But Savage was there, and he went ballistic on Shawn Michaels and Scott Hall when they got back through that curtain, because they were ignoring their time cues. And Savage hated that, Shawn and his buddies, the Clique, they were essentially starting to run the company at that point. To him, it was one of the cardinal sins that you could commit. You've got other guys who are waiting to go out there and have their match. It's WrestleMania. It's a big payday, the biggest show of the year. And these guys are really being selfish, because they know they have to go home, as they say, and they don't go home. They stay out there for another, whatever it is, 5 minutes, 8 minutes. It doesn't matter. What ended up happening is there was a 10-man tag that involved Bob and I think Jeff Jarrett and a bunch of other guys that had to be cut. And the match ended up bumped to an edition of Monday Night Raw instead. It's a big difference between WrestleMania and Monday Night Raw, especially WrestleMania at the Garden. So I can understand why Savage would be upset about that. The other thing about Randy Savage here, obviously there have been a lot of rumors over the years about something that may or may not have happened between Savage and a young Stephanie McMahon. Who really knows? Savage is not around anymore. Unless Stephanie comes clean one day and addresses it, which I don't think she's ever done. We may never know. All that Bob will say about it in the book is that they were pretty friendly. That's what he says about Savage and Stephanie. They were pretty friendly, and he leaves it at that. So there you go. Triple H is also a big subject in the book, and Holly says that Triple H ass-kissed his way into the Clique, and he ass-kissed his way to the top of the industry. So I think you could tell what Bob Holly thinks of Triple H. He also confirms the story, which I think Steve Austin and Scott Hall also confirmed it when Scott Hall was on Steve Austin's podcast not too long ago, that Triple H was going to win the King of the Ring in 1996. And what happened is the curtain call incident at Madison Square Garden went down, where Diesel and Razor were leaving the company. They were going to WCW. Diesel was a heel. Razor Ramon was a babyface. Triple H was a heel. Shawn was a babyface. And all of them essentially broke kayfabe. They were in the ring together, hugging and embracing and posing, and the crowd loved it. But a lot of people were very upset by that. Somebody had to be punished. Can't punish the guys who were leaving the company. And you can't punish the WWF champion, which is what Shawn was at the time. So Triple H got screwed. Steve Austin won the King of the Ring instead. And I think things turned out pretty well for both guys. He also talks about an argument that I often hear from people who have worked for WWE. And I'm going to single out Jim Ross on this also, because Jim Ross will on Twitter or in his blogs, address this. And Holly calls it a bullshit argument, this office argument about pitching your own ideas and getting yourself over. Because you've heard them talk about that before. It's up to the talent, right? The talent has to grab the brass ring, and they have to get themselves over, and they have to go the extra mile and all this stuff. And Holly mentions Zack Ryder in his book. And he says one of the things you hear most in WWE meetings is that you've got to make your own push. And he says it's a load of crap. He says he used to give them ideas for himself, and they would get thrown right back in his face. So at the end of the day, you're only going to go as far as they want you to go. And if they lose interest in you, you're toast. You're done. That's it. I mean, look at Fandango. Fandango was Vince McMahon's pet project earlier this year. And Vince was pushing him to the moon. It looked like he was probably going to end up with the Intercontinental title. And then he got hurt. He got a concussion. He was out for a number of weeks. And since he came back, what have they really done with Fandango? You know, most weeks he comes out, he wrestles, and he walks out. They do the walkout finish. That's it. They've done nothing with Fandango since. So that's an example that when Vince or whoever loses interest in you, you're done. You're finished. And I guess Zack Ryder falls into that category also. But I wanted to mention that because when I hear, and again, I'm just using Jim Ross as an example because I've heard him say this before. And look, I don't work for WWE, but Bob Holly did, okay, for 15 years. And I agree with him. How are you supposed to get yourself over if when you do things to try to make people notice you, it either falls on deaf ears or you get punished for it because it wasn't their idea? It's almost like you're doing yourself no favors by trying to come up with your own ideas because they're going to look down on you for doing it. It doesn't make any sense. So he talks about that in the book as well. Chapter 16, he gets into Montreal in '97. His take, he was there that night at the Molson Center. And he calls Shawn Michaels the best wrestler that he's ever seen. He thinks Shawn Michaels is the best wrestler of all time. And this is in spite of all the criticism that he levies against Shawn. I mean, you could tell he and Shawn had some run-ins. He didn't necessarily think very highly of Shawn as a person, but he's able to set that criticism aside and admit the fact that, as much as he may hate to admit it, this guy was the greatest performer he's ever seen. And he mentions that Raw match in the UK from '07 that Shawn had with John Cena as this fantastic match. And it was actually a really good match. I thought it was better than their WrestleMania match. So that's another example of a guy who, even though he may hate somebody or used to hate somebody, he can separate that from the fact that they're actually really talented. And he's not just shitting on Shawn Michaels because he's got this personal vendetta against him. So that I appreciate that. He says John Cena can't wrestle and he can't lead a match. So it's kind of straightforward there. I would wonder, though, again, if I could ask Bob, what he would attribute Cena's success to over all these years. Obviously, he's had the machine behind him. WWE's been shoving him down our throats for almost 10 years now. So he must be good on some level. I disagree. I don't think Cena can't wrestle because he's had so many great matches. You just get to a point where it's like, okay, can we all admit that John Cena can wrestle, even if he's not the best wrestler in the world? He's had so many classic matches over the years, and not necessarily always with the most talented opponent. I mean, CM Punk is obviously a great wrestler. Shawn Michaels is a great wrestler, but he's had great matches with other guys also, and big guys, guys like JBL and Triple H and Randy Orton. But that's his feelings on John Cena. Talks about Brawl for All, which he participated in, the Brawl for All tournament back in '98. Jim Ross was going around talking up Dr. Death, Steve Williams, who he was buddies with. They brought Dr. Death in. I guess the idea was that Dr. Death was going to plow through everybody in the Brawl for All tournament, and ultimately it would lead to a program on top for the title with him and Steve Austin. And according to Bob Holly, nobody bothered filling in the wrestlers about this. As far as everybody knew, it was a shoot. The idea was to go out there, do your best, try to win. And obviously what ended up happening is Dr. Death got his ass knocked out by Bart Gunn. And in the process in that fight, he also, I think he tore his hamstring. He suffered a leg injury. And that was it. I don't know that Dr. Death really did all that much. I think when Jim Ross came back the following year after the Bell's palsy with the gimmick where he was like the evil heel announcer, I think he had Dr. Death with him. But basically that was all Dr. Death ever did. His run in WWE was a complete and total bust. And it goes back to the Brawl for All because this plan that they had for him went out the window because, Bart Gunn was like, hey, Jim Ross is going around talking about how this guy's shit don't stink. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go out there and knock him on his ass. That's what he did. And according to Bob Holly, it led to the downfall of Bart Gunn. He firmly believes that the fact that they put Bart in this, fight with Butterbean at WrestleMania. All of that was done intentionally because they knew he was going to get his ass kicked. He did get his ass kicked, and after that, he got cut. He was gone from WWE, and I think he's maybe come back. I think he was on the Raw 15th anniversary show in a Battle Royal. I think that's the only appearance he's made for them since then. He talked about the new Midnight Express, where he and Bart were tag team partners. Talked about being on the Job Squad with Al Snow and all those guys. And the Job Squad is what led to the birth of Hardcore Holly, which is where he had his greatest success in his WWE career. He talked about being backstage after his Over the Edge 99 match against Al Snow. That came right before what was supposed to be Owen Hart's match against The Godfather. He remembers seeing Bruce Pritchard running by screaming, Owen fell, Owen fell. And he talks about how Owen had reservations about doing the stunt that night and going up to the ceiling, and was talking to people about it before the show. And he heard somebody tell Owen to just say something, say something about not doing it. And Owen's response to that was, "You know how that is," basically implying that if he refused to do it, he'd be fired, or maybe he'd be punished or de-pushed in some way. This is what he heard. He heard this conversation happen. And which just makes it even more depressing, the fact that Owen really did have these reservations about doing it, but felt, his job may be in jeopardy if he didn't do it, and we all know what happened there. He gets into the match with Brock Lesnar, which is the match where Lesnar basically dropped Holly on his head and broke his neck. He says he never sandbagged Brock. Some people have accused him of that over the years. He was trying to make Brock look bad by, not cooperating on the move. He said he never did that. That's complete BS. It was just a botched spot, which they actually redid because it was a SmackDown show. It was a taped show, so they did the spot over again. He said Brock felt terrible about it, and that whole thing apparently has been completely blown out of proportion over the years. The story that has been told, according to Bob, is absolutely not true. No hard feelings, no ill will. It was just a botched spot. That's it. Then he gets into the Tough Enough incident with Matt Cappotelli, which is, again, another infamous incident that he was part of. He makes no apologies for it. Matt Cappotelli was, I think it was season 2, I want to say, of Tough Enough. He was an up-and-coming guy in the developmental system in OVW, where he ended up later on, and he ended up with a brain tumor. And I think he's still around, but he's not wrestling. But he was on Tough Enough. Bob was in there with him. He was, showing him some tough love. He kicked him hard. He was chopping him. He bloodied him up. I think he gave him a busted lip and maybe a black eye or something like that. And Cappotelli, I remember seeing Cappotelli on TV. He was in tears. He was crying about what happened. Holly makes no apologies for it. He didn't go in there with the intention of injuring him, putting him on the shelf, hurting him in any major way. He went in there. He was the enforcer. That was his role. He makes no apologies for what happened with the Tough Enough incident. He says he absolutely would have gone into MMA if he was 20 years younger. I've heard a lot of wrestlers say that. I think even Undertaker once was asked about that in an interview. And this was back a couple of years ago when MMA was even hotter than it is now. Because MMA has cooled off a little bit, at least, from its peak. Not as much as wrestling's cooled off from its peak. But he says he absolutely would have tried it. He says MMA is taking more and more guys away from wrestling, which begs the question, how do you stem that tide? Or is the tide turning? Are we starting to see maybe where guys who were going into MMA instead of wrestling all of a sudden are coming back to wrestling? Because wrestling maybe now has regained some of that popularity when MMA has waned, maybe just a little bit. But how do you stem that tide is I think, the real question here. If you've got more and more guys going into this real sport and not wanting to go into pro wrestling, it makes you wonder how many guys that we see in UFC maybe could have been on WWE television. There's a lot of MMA guys who I think would really thrive in wrestling. Chael Sonnen. If Chael Sonnen gave up mixed martial arts tomorrow and wanted to come sign a contract with WWE, I think that would be phenomenal. Even though he's a little bit older now, he certainly has the promo skills and he's still in pretty good shape. But, TNA has brought in some MMA guys. They brought in Tito Ortiz, who's had a couple of back fusions and a neck fusion and is way past his expiration date. They have Rampage Jackson. But the problem there is that the focus has been on those guys when they're not really doing anything. I'm talking about an MMA guy coming in and actually training and becoming, a relatively full-time performer, which is not what we're seeing in TNA right now. But there's a lot of guys in MMA who I think would do very well in wrestling. He has some controversial comments, Bob does, about women's wrestling. He says, I don't care for women's wrestling. They put these women out there who can't work a lick. It exposes the business. Fans don't want to see women wrestle. They want tits and ass. That's what he thinks. He mentions Alundra Blaze, good wrestler, but nobody cared. When she was in WWF and she was the champ, nobody gave a shit. Then Sable came along and added real sex appeal to it, and she was a huge draw. And he's right. If you think about it, what was Sunny's appeal? Sunny was, the first diva, so to speak, in WWE. With her, I remember the covers of like Raw magazine where she was walking around in lingerie. They did those vignettes with her sitting naked in a bathtub with a candle. It was all about sex appeal. So maybe he has a point. I don't think that same point applies now. I think there is interest in women's wrestling. It's just that WWE does not promote women's wrestling the way that they probably should. With them, now it's all about Total Divas. But go back to before Total Divas premiered on TV. The Divas would get their 2 minutes on television, and that's it. I mean, there was a period of a couple of months there where they weren't even on the show. At least now with this show, it's had some success. They're starting to put the women on TV. I think AJ Lee is fantastic. I think she's great. They've got some great women down in NXT. They've got Emma. They've got Paige. Ric Flair's daughter is down there now. She's still very green, but she looks pretty good. So I don't necessarily agree that people don't care. They don't want to see women wrestle. I think probably from the time period he's remembering, that was probably true at that time. Tells a story about Paul Bearer being phased down as a manager for The Undertaker when Undertaker didn't need him anymore. They were grooming him to be the timekeeper in the gorilla position, which is the role that Gerald Briscoe used to have. Billy Kidman now does. He sits back there and keeps time cues to make sure that, I don't know if he does it for SmackDown, but for Raw and probably the pay-per-views, time management, very important. So they were testing Paul Bearer out for the position. And during his tryout in the role, he apparently made a joke about Kevin Dunn, who was the head of the production team there in WWE, and didn't realize that Kevin Dunn could actually hear what he was saying back in the truck. And he ended up losing his job not long after that. Because if you remember, Paul Bearer went away for a while and didn't come back for a couple of years, whatever it was. Apparently that's the story behind why Paul Bearer disappeared. I was not aware of that, so I thought that was very interesting. Chapter 28 of the book, he mentions how he put over a ton of guys. You go back to the early 2000s, the mid-2000s. He put over guys like Luther Reigns, the Basham brothers, Nunzio, Kenzo Suzuki, not one of which are even in the company anymore, which I think is quite the indictment on John Laurinaitis, who was the head of talent relations at that time. He talks about his time on the ECW brand. All of the guys that were pushed ahead of him. Bobby Lashley was going to be the end-all, be-all. He was going to be the next big thing in WWE. And Bobby Lashley ended up quitting the company. They pushed Test and Umaga over him, both of whom, as he points out, died of drug overdoses. He actually talked about how Umaga's spot in that Battle of the Billionaires match at WrestleMania 23, which is one of the biggest matches in the history of that company, not so much because of Lashley and Umaga, but because of Vince McMahon and Donald Trump. But that did humongous business. Originally, Umaga's spot in that match was earmarked for Bob Holly, or at least that's what Vince McMahon had told him. And there's actually many examples through the book like that where Vince would, or somebody would tell him one thing or would promise him that this is what we're going to do, and then it never happened. There's actually quite a few examples throughout the book of that happening. Talks about the wellness policy in WWE. He admits to his own steroid use. Again, use, not abuse, so he doesn't claim that he took everything under the sun and took large doses of it, but he certainly dabbled in steroids, I think, as most guys probably did back during that period. He actually talked about a lot of different top stars in WWE who were not regularly being tested, and I'm not sure if that's still going on now, but at that time, according to Holly, they weren't being tested hardly at all. And he said the whole program was a joke. And he actually claims that Undertaker and Ric Flair, point blank, refused to take a drug test. And they made it very clear that they would just as soon as walk out of the company if they had to submit to one. He did say that Triple H, when he was a full-time performer, Batista, John Cena, they were the top stars in the company at that time. They were all tested, which he says, he saw them personally being tested. But he questions the results because those three didn't shrink. They didn't get any smaller. A lot of guys, when they really started implementing the wellness testing, a lot of guys shrunk. I think Chris Masters is one of the great examples of a guy who was jacked to the gills, and one day it looked like somebody let the air out of him. But those three guys pretty much maintained their physical stature throughout that entire period. And John Cena, I think, is just a freak of nature. Cena's pretty much looked the same for the last 10 years. But that's an interesting point of view that he puts forth there. Then he gets into the Chris Benoit stuff. He actually has a chapter dedicated to Benoit and a story that I was not aware of. He and Benoit, he considered Benoit a good friend, and Benoit had wanted him to stop by his home. And this was only a few days before the incident that went down. Holly was supposed to stop by, and he never did. And apparently Benoit was furious. He made Holly promise to stop by next time. Benoit told Bob that Nancy was acting like Hitler, and he just had to get out of the house. So it sounds to me almost like, whatever was going on at the time, he wanted his friend to stop by so he could just take his mind off whatever else was going on and just get away from it all. And when they ended their conversation, that last conversation, Benoit went home that same day and killed his wife and kid and then killed himself. So that's got to be, boy, you could tell that, it obviously affected Holly. How could it not? If you're in that situation, here's this guy that you consider a friend, somebody who, off camera, off the road, you could, hang out with, and you're supposed to go over. This guy desperately wants you to come over to his house. There's stuff going on, and you don't. And you have this conversation with him, and then that same day, he goes home and does what he did. That's insane. So that's pretty heavy stuff. Talked about teaming with Cody Rhodes and being double-crossed by him and Dusty. And he talks about that match where Cody Rhodes turned heel. It was supposed to be Cody and Bob, who were the tag team champions, going up against Ted DiBiase Jr. and a mystery partner. And that mystery partner turned out to be Cody, who turned on his partner. And I don't even know, can you say that Cody lost the tag team title in that match? He basically lost it and then won it back. I don't even know, in the so-called record books, how that would be reflected. But he talks about being double-crossed. This is a little murky to me because I actually went back and watched that match. I'm not quite sure where this supposed double-cross may have taken place, but I guess maybe backstage afterwards he saw Cody, over with Dusty, and they kind of went on their way. And I don't know where the actual double-cross happened. I don't know if it was a situation where they felt that in their tag team matches maybe Bob was being featured a little too much, taking away some attention from Cody, and they wanted to try to teach Bob a lesson by, somehow double-crossing him in a match. That whole story's a little murky to me, but supposedly he was double-crossed by Cody and Dusty. He says he considers himself, happily semi-retired. He would be very happy to do training seminars. He would love to do something else on TV. Obviously, he was a coach that time on Tough Enough, but he wouldn't mind doing some reality TV or even hosting a show. He says anything to do with NASCAR would be good. He's really big into NASCAR and riding his dirt bike and all that kind of stuff. There's a chapter on Triple H. I mentioned before, he does not think very highly of Triple H. He does call him one of the greatest workers of all time, so kind of like Shawn Michaels, where he can admit, hey, this guy in the ring is pretty good. But he also calls him a backstabbing SOB. Somebody who will praise you to your face and then trash you behind your back. He was told that he spoke badly of Bob to Vince McMahon, especially after the Rene Dupree incident did Triple H. I guess Triple H supposedly talked crap about Bob to Vince. So, yeah. The stuff on Triple H in this book, by and large, even though he thinks he's a good worker, not good. He does not have a good impression of the guy who will one day be running the company. So, his main problem with wrestling these days, he thinks the talent pool is just very weak. He thinks younger guys don't realize how good they have it now because they never would have survived back in the 90s or back in the territorial days. He says, look at the difference between Randy Orton and Matt Cappotelli. Two guys that Bob says he tested out within only a few months of each other. Orton took his knocks, took his lumps, didn't complain, he hung in there. And now he's the WWE champion. He's one of the biggest stars in the industry. And Capitelli thought it would be cool to go on a reality show and to be a star. And he calls the ass kicking he gave him pretty tame. He says one tame ass kicking later, he was reconsidering everything. He was reconsidering his life. And he says that's the fundamental difference between a lot of the guys that you see now, the younger guys, and the other guys who went on to superstardom, because those guys could take it and the other guys couldn't. Again, that's his opinion. Talks about WWE's Tough Enough reboot a couple of years ago. It bothered him to see Trish Stratus as a trainer. Really bothered him to see her on there. He says he likes Trish, but what does she know about training wrestlers? He says she needed to be one of the students, not one of the trainers. He says she didn't get in the ring to show them anything because that would have exposed her. That's why she just stood on the floor and pointed. So that's his thoughts on the Tough Enough reboot. He does not like seeing guys like Sheamus come in and have things handed to him because he was buddies with Triple H. He was the WWE champion within 6 months, which I don't know if that's accurate or not. I know he was on the ECW brand, Sheamus was, before he came to TV. He did get the WWE championship very quickly after he made his debut, so I know that is true. I just don't know if it's actually within 6 months. He says it was like Bobby Lashley and Brock Lesnar all over again, just being handed stuff. Sheamus stuck around, but, what if he didn't? What if he was one of those guys who got the big push and then disappeared and quit? And meanwhile, the company just sacrificed half their roster for a guy who doesn't deserve it. And he says they often have a lot of guys who are very good, who do deserve it, but it comes down to politics. And in any other pro sport, you play your best guys. And I've said this before about Jim Ross on the Sound Off. When they took Jim Ross off television for the final time, and probably all the other times that they did, it just boggled my mind, because Jim Ross is still to this day regarded probably as the greatest play-by-play guy in the history of pro wrestling. And Jim Ross has not been on television doing commentary in a while. I bet that if you put JR back on TV next Monday, he wouldn't miss a beat, because he's that good at what he does. And it just didn't make any sense to me that they had this guy under contract who everybody loves and everybody says is the greatest of all time, certainly one of the greatest. And it's like benching your best player. You're going to bench your best player for somebody who isn't as good. And that's not a knock on Michael Cole. I actually like Michael Cole. I think he's grown into the role on Raw now with King and JBL. I actually like that three-man booth they have. But for a long time, I was saying that. A lot of people were saying that. Why are you benching your best guy? You're playing somebody who isn't as good as this guy who you have under contract. It just didn't make any sense. So I agree with Holly on that point. I think he makes a very good point. He says the main event of WrestleMania 27 was John Cena versus The Miz, and it was horrible. And to that I say, thank you. Because, again, I have said that numerous times on the Sound Off. I think that John Cena versus The Miz is the worst main event in WrestleMania history. And that includes Lawrence Taylor and Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 11. Because, if anything, at least in that match, I can honestly say that Lawrence Taylor actually kind of impressed me. He actually wasn't as horrible as I expected him to be. Which is probably the best thing I could say about that match. Even that was more entertaining than Cena vs. Miz was at WrestleMania 27. So I agree 100% on that point. Holly praises Dolph Ziggler as somebody who, meanwhile, while Cena vs. Miz were wrestling in the main event of Mania that year, Ziggler was working underneath on the same card for like a minute, which is kind of depressing, because here we are now a few years later, and Dolph Ziggler's kind of right back in the same spot he was then. He says Miz couldn't carry Dolph's bags, which I think we all know. He also praises guys like Ted DiBiase Jr., who isn't with the company anymore. He actually just left. Drew McIntyre, who is criminally underrated, I think, in that company. I think they have destroyed him. I don't think that anybody could ever look at Drew McIntyre ever again and regard him as anything more than just a mid-card guy, which is a shame. Because I've seen Drew McIntyre's work back when he was in developmental, working matches against Sheamus, who went on to big things. and McIntyre was the babyface. He was winning those matches. He hung in there with Sheamus. He looked really good. They started pushing him out of the gate. I think he was the Intercontinental Champion. And as Holly says in the book, he has no idea why they stopped pushing him, why they stopped pushing DiBiase. It boggles his mind. He thinks they have not groomed the next generation properly. So you end up with guys like Miz and Wade Barrett, who he says are fine in the mid-card, but they can't get the job done at a top level. I will disagree with him on Wade Barrett. I don't know where the hate comes from for Wade. I think Wade is actually very good, and I think one day Wade will be up there. He will be wrestling, for the World Heavyweight title and all that. So I disagree with him on Wade Barrett. Agree with him on The Miz and some of the other guys that he mentioned in the book. One common theme early and later in the book is how he regrets not reaching out to his father. And I want to go back to his father for a second here, because I mentioned earlier he talks about his upbringing and not really knowing his father. Later on, his father would reach out to him when he was a big star on TV, and Bob kind of shunned him because, of course, now I'm a big star, now you want to talk to me. It's like, get lost. And he really regrets not reaching out to his father before his father died. You can really pick up on that because he mentions it a whole bunch of times in the book. He was hurt because his father had been out of his life for so long, showed no interest in him until he was on TV, and now he wishes they could have forged some semblance of a father-son relationship. So that's one of the kind of emotional undertones, I guess, of the book. He says people are shocked when they see his real personality is nothing like what he portrayed on television. He thinks he's very misunderstood. He's not a bully in real life. That's not who he is. He's actually the complete opposite of that in real life if you meet him. And then we get to the happily ever after part of the story. He tells the tale of finding his, I believe she was his high school sweetheart. He mentions her earlier in the book. He actually finds his high school sweetheart after 30 years. Okay, so they've been apart for 30 years. She had joined the army, and she was being stationed elsewhere, so they went their separate ways. Fast forward to 2009, he's out of WWE. He's at home one day with, I think, some family, and he happens to ask his brother if he knew whatever happened to Linda. Just, I guess maybe they were watching a movie or something, and he just, whatever happened to her. And his brother said he actually just talked to her on Facebook. And Bob had no idea what Facebook even was, so he joined. And he mustered up the courage to send her a message, and it just kind of went from there. And they got married the following year. He moved to Dubuque, Iowa, where I believe is where he resides, and he hasn't looked back since. So it's actually really nice to see, a guy from that period, a wrestler, have a happy ending to his story. Yeah, he's got a lot of injuries. He talks about, waking up in pain every single day. He's had neck issues. He had neck surgery. He feels pretty beat up. You're going to feel beat up doing what he does for a living. But all in all, I think it's a happy ending to his story. And I really like the book overall. And for all the detail I gave here in this review, there's a lot of other stuff in there that I didn't even talk about, I didn't even touch on. I would recommend that you pick up a copy of the book. I do think it's worth it to buy a copy, whether it's hardcover, paperback, Kindle version. I don't care, whatever suits your needs. But I definitely think that The Hardcore Truth is a book worth going out of your way to read. It is refreshing in that he tells it like it is. He's got nothing to hide. He's got nothing to be worried about as far as future employment. He worked there for 15 years. He had 15 great years in WWE. Good times, bad times, and everything in between. And it's very refreshing to hear from somebody who just wants to tell his story and not worry about any of that other stuff. So I would definitely give it a thumbs up, definitely recommend. You can follow Bob on Twitter at @TheBobHolly, and you can follow me on Twitter if you want to, at Solomonster. Again, I host the weekly Solomonster Sounds Off Wrestling podcast, have since 2007. You can go back in the archives, find all nearly 300 episodes that we have in the archives on thesolomonster.com. You can stream us on Stitcher Radio or subscribe in iTunes. And I hope you enjoyed this review. It's the first Sound Off Extra that I'm posting here on our YouTube channel, which has been neglected for far too long. And so hopefully I'll be having more of these types of videos going up in the future. So until next time, I am the Solomonster. Be well, stay safe, please check out the Sound Off, and we'll see you right back here next time.